What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be telling you or showing you how it is that we're building speed and using it as a superpower. And the mission for these is just to show our builds real and raw, just to basically show you the good, the bad, the ugly, how we're implementing mental models into what it is that we're building, and also just to solve big problems within organizations, and also just to build a network of visionaries, basically people that get the mission that we're striving for, and ultimately just to build a network of cool people doing cool things as well. And how I'm actively implementing speed as a superpower is broken down into 5 simple steps, as always, which number one is being fast pitches, striking while it's hot, because the number one thing that deal happens is deals don't wait. They ultimately want you to solve their problems as soon as possible, and that's why I pitch planners before chaos buries them, because the number one thing that I have realized is that chaos never waits for anyone. So why should you wait to pitch to people that are actively facing that problem? Because the way that I like to think about it is actively solving other people's problems, and why wait to solve their problems when they're facing it right now? And just actively asking those questions of saying, hey, why are they facing these problems right now, and why aren't we doing something to help them? Ultimately saying, hey, we crafted a killer pitch, saved hours, protects your events in 2 hours, send it to 10 planners same day, got replies. So basically saying, hey, we built this in 2 hours, now we're sending it out just to ultimately just get feedback, and in the sense that, hey, we got this feedback back from them, how can we ultimately tweak this, and what is it that is matching within our messaging and our positioning that ultimately just allows us to get replies, and asking the questions of saying, hey, if we got replies, how many of those are popping and how many of those are flopping? And ultimately just gathering that data and striking while it's hot, saying, hey, we need to just send out messages to solve their problems, and we need to respond as well as quickly as possible, so that we also just ultimately bridge that gap in terms of them saying, hey, they know us now simply because we sent them a message today and we've responded today. Whereas if they respond today and you send them a message 2-3 days later, they ultimately just forget about you, and you don't want to do that, especially when you're building a solution that ultimately just solves a chaos, because they're facing it right now. So why would you solve it in 5-10 years time or a couple months time? And DMing planners saying, hey, your ops is chaos, let's fix it right now, quick, direct, done. Saying, hey, you're facing chaos, we ultimately just want to solve that for you, let us do that. If not, that's okay, but we are here to help you. And the biggest lesson that I have learned from this is speed in outreach turns cold leads into warm leads. Saying, hey, if you're actively sending out messages and you're taking 2-3 days to respond, ultimately that turns those warmer leads into cold leads, which isn't good for your pipeline, because ultimately those are lost opportunities that you could have just turned into clients, simply because your response rate to them and follow-up sequence was not up to scratch, which ultimately loses trust. And that is the number one thing that you don't want to happen, which ultimately leads to the question. And the question that I like to ask here from first principles is, what's the simplest, most direct way to communicate my value to a customer right now? And this step, I specifically just asked two things. How can I make sure that the messaging and positioning is correct? Because if it sticks, if they're facing that problem right now, if the messaging and positioning is accurate, then ultimately that's gonna land. And that's my personal belief, to say, hey, if someone is facing this problem right there and then, why would they wait to solve it then? So why should you delay your process in terms of saying, hey, we have this problem, let us solve it for you. If not today, then cool, maybe into the future you might have it, and if you do, we want to stay top of mind. And just simply asking those questions ultimately just help us understand, to say, hey, we understand that you're facing these problems and we're ultimately just here, but we also need to make sure from our side that our pitches are making sure that we're fast in our pitches, and also iterating them at a much quicker rate as well, and just learning from them as much as possible, which ultimately leads us to moving on to the next point, which is ship MVPs, don't stress it. Basically saying, hey, we need to make sure that we don't focus too much on perfection, because perfection kills progress. I ship fast then iterate, basically saying we need an MVP out there right there and then ultimately we can build from that, because without that MVP, you're not going to know where the direction is going to lead you, if the solution actually works for the client that you're building it out for. And ultimately just having that MVP allows you to see a lot more and gives you a depth of scope that you wouldn't have had if you didn't simply just build out that MVP. And what I'm actively doing is saying, hey, building a planner's dashboard in Figma, saying, hey, we are building this dashboard in Figma. This is what it's going to look like. This is what we're also getting the stakeholders buy-in to say, hey, you also like this. This is what we're tracking. This is how we're going to do this, making sure that everything is done in Figma, and then saying, hey, it's not flawless, but it allows us to map out what it is that we need to build, what are the core functionalities that we need to build in order to achieve the ultimate solution that we're ultimately building for. And if it's not a custom solution, we can use Airtable and automation tools to say, hey, to deliver, we built the system, now we're going to deliver it in 48 hours if it's not fully custom, and then we ultimately just plug in those systems in order to allow you to run like clockwork within 48 hours if it's not a full-fledged custom solution, which takes a bit less time but ultimately just achieves that speed. But even if it's a fully custom platform, we try our best to ultimately just get that MVP out as soon as possible in order to get you that full depth of feel and taste to say, hey, this is how it works, and this is ultimately what we're going to build out from that, and just iterating on that on a constant basis. And then the biggest lesson that I have learned here is done beats perfect every single time, to say, hey, we're focusing on the results, because the number one thing that we want to focus on is ultimately the results, because nothing else matters except for results. And striving for results ultimately just allows you to get stuff done all where you wouldn't think was possible, to say, hey, nothing else matters, we just need to focus on results. If there's one thing that we had to focus on, we simply just need to focus on getting the result, and through that we build out the MVP to say, hey, is this leading us to the source of truth or the result that we're actively seeking for? If not, how can we refine it best? And the first principles question that I come up from this is, what's the minimal viable solution I can deliver to create value to my customer today? Saying, hey, we need something that is minimal, that takes minimal amount of time, effort, but ultimately allows us to achieve the result that we're ultimately building for, or a mini result that we're ultimately building for, so that when we build out the full-fledged result, we ultimately just understand all of the data points, and we actively are just building it right and focusing on the 3-4 key pillars that we're ultimately building the solution for, which ultimately allows us to move on to the third point, which is learning in hours, not in weeks. Saying, hey, feedback's my fuel, and the quicker I do it, the quicker I get it. And saying, hey, I need to use feedback as my fuel in order to say, hey, we need to learn as much as possible, and we need to shorten the time frame of how we learn things and iterate things as well, to say, hey, sent a tally so poll after the call, what's breaking, got answers, fix the feature same day, to say, hey, we're getting these messages of saying, hey, XYZ is not working, how can we now get this rolling out same day or the next day minimum? And that's what we're saying, hey, we need to actively just say, building that feedback loop of saying, hey, we need to actively just make sure that we're learning in hours, not in weeks, because this allows us to then scale in terms of our learning process, and also just implementing different strategies as well in terms of that. And ask the planner saying, hey, what's your top pain? Built to fix in 24 hours, to say, hey, we built an MVP. It wasn't fully custom, but hey, if you want a fully custom solution, we build it as soon as possible so that you can get a feel and taste of what it is that we're actively building, and ultimately just scaling that into the future. And the biggest lesson is fast feedback means fast improvement. Ultimately saying, hey, if we get feedback today, we can ultimately just improve our product as soon as possible, and ultimately just provide the solution even faster, because we have feedback, and feedback is the number one fuel for what it is that we're building. And just saying, hey, we need to have strategies and systems in place in terms of our feedback, or we're gonna fail. And that is the number one thing that I'm super bullish on, is simply just feedback is fuel for so many things that we build. And ultimately just getting the stakeholders buy-in, everyone involved in the project, we ultimately are able to build a solution that makes everyone happy. And the first principles question I like to ask from this is, what's the fastest way to validate whether my solution solves a real problem for my customer? Saying, hey, what are the anchor points that we can have in order to say, hey, this validates what it is that we're building actually solves their problem? Or just saying, hey, if we built XYZ, would this solve your problem? And saying, hey, also tying that with saying, hey, we built this MVP, try it, and if it solves your problem, then that's validation. That's the validation that we need, which ultimately just allows us to then lead with feedback and ultimately just scale the solution into the future, which ultimately just leads to the fourth point, which is no overthinking, saying, hey, hesitation's a dream killer. I decide fast and then adjust, saying ultimately we need to make sure that we're not hesitating in terms of what we do, because the faster we iterate, the faster we do things, we're ultimately just not overthinking things and we're just actively doing, because overthinking things ultimately sometimes gets you to a place where you're not getting stuff done. And the number one place you don't want to be is not getting stuff done, or just trying and implementing new things when you're on over, when you're constantly just overthinking things and saying, hey, this is not working, and we all honestly just needs to improve what it is that we're doing, saying, hey, built a tech stack, Airtable, make.com in 30 minutes, started building the same day, to say, hey, doesn't matter what it is that we're building, we're ultimately just striving for the result, and the result is going to get us to where we need to. So why are we spending so much time deciding which way we need to take? Ultimately just building out the solution, and the ultimate result is only the only thing that our client cares about, and ultimately just striving for that as soon as possible is what we need to take into consideration. And built a ODCAM for faster decision making framework, which is my personal framework that I implement in terms of my team, to say, hey, we need to make these objectives, decisions, clarifications, actions, and measurements, saying, hey, these are the things that we define as our core five pillars, and ultimately just say, hey, we need to base our decisions off of this. And if we ever find ourselves lacking in terms of speed to execution, then we ultimately just need to have a decision making framework that works and that we all understand, that ultimately allows us to move closer to our source of truth, and that ultimately just gets us to the result that we ultimately striving for. And the biggest lesson that I've learned here is speed in decisions keeps momentum alive. And the number one thing that has ultimately helped me out is building the ODCAM framework, which ultimately just allows my team and also for me to move more tactically and agilely into what it is that we're building and make decisions much faster without overthinking things. Because one of the things that I have personally realized is when you start overthinking things, you start over analyzing and you just don't get stuff done. And that is the place that you don't want to be, to not get stuff done, because ultimately you just want to keep cranking out the machine, testing out new things. Is this working? Is this not working? And just asking questions that lead you to the source of truth that you're seeking in terms of what it is that we're building, and asking the question from first principles of what's the core outcome I need from this decision and what's the simplest way to achieve it, saying, hey, we need to break this down to say, what is the overarching goal and what is the decision I need to make in order to get to that overarching goal, and what's the simplest way to achieve it? Is it through a template? Is it through saying, hey, we need to build a full-fledged custom solution? Because ultimately situations vary, but most of the time that I found it's ultimately just building a custom tailored made solution, which ultimately achieves the source of truth, which leads us to then ultimately just build a custom solution that allows us to scale the solution into the future and allows our clients to be satisfied because their solution is super tailored to their business and it is not just a generic template, which ultimately leads us to the fifth point, which is fast vision, sprint towards the big picture. And this is the one that ties everything up together. And why this is key is speed fuels my $100 million dream tomorrow. Every quick win stacks to say, hey, we have this ultimate dream that we're building for, and ultimately we want to reach that. But in order to do that, we need to stack as many wins as we can today in order to get there. And just understanding what it is that we're building, saying, hey, we shipped a landing page in 3 days, and just constantly getting that time down to say, hey, can we ship it in 2 days? Can we ship it in a day? Ultimately just saying, hey, how do we reduce the time that we need to get stuff done, which ultimately fuels the vision for the bigger goal and ultimately allows us to get feedback and learn from that, which ultimately gets us a step closer to that ultimate vision. And posted daily videos like we're doing here caught a heavy hitter's eye, sparked a convo saying, hey, I just want to network with cool people, and this is the platform to do it. And I know that what it is that we're building is only going to scale into the future. And this is my own take on it. And I just want to make sure that what I'm doing resonates with a lot of people at this stage, because at this stage, we're still in the trenches building and just figuring stuff out. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just to build a network of cool people doing cool things. And that is the number one thing that matters to me in this current present moment in time, so that we're just learning and bouncing ideas off of each other, which ultimately leads to the big lesson that I've learned is fast moves today build the empire tomorrow. Saying, hey, the faster we move today, the closer we get to the empire that we're building into the future, because we don't constantly have to start things from scratch. We already have a system in place that ultimately allows us to reach our ultimate goal. But in order to do that, we need to just start winning faster today in order to get there tomorrow. And the first principles question that I like to ask here that ties every single thing up together is, what's the fundamental step I can take right now to align my daily actions with my long-term vision? Because once you know that everything compounds, every single decision we make today compounds, whether it's making these videos, whether it's making out solutions, whether it's custom built templates, or what it is that we're building, ultimately fuels the vision for tomorrow. And constantly just understanding that allows us to say, hey, what we're doing ultimately compounds, so let's make sure it compounds in a positive way. Let's make sure what it is that we're building ultimately just compounds in a manner that reaches us closer to our goals. Of course, we're going to make mistakes. That's only possible through actually doing things, and that's okay. Now, it just then becomes a question of how do we bounce back from that, and how do we iterate and become better off of those mistakes, and constantly just pushing the needle of what we think is possible to actually what we know we can achieve, and just pushing the needle to say, hey, what we know we can achieve tomorrow might be 10, 20 times what we think today. So let's keep pushing for that in order to get there. And this is just my own personal take on this. This is why I think speed as a superpower will only guide us further into what it is that we're building in terms of decision making, and also just getting stuff done, which is the most important thing. And I know that into the future, this is only going to allow us to build better mental models and also scale our frameworks into the future. And we're going to make a lot of mistakes. I know that we are, but it's all part of the game. It's all part of learning, and it's all part of growth. And I'm super excited to keep on iterating and keep innovating as much as possible, and using speed as a superpower tied in with that, and ultimately just reaching the vision of what it is that we're building, and ultimately just building a network of cool people doing cool things along the way. And this is my own take on it, and I hope you guys enjoy this. If you guys enjoy this, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I'll see you guys in the next video.